an audit. Until recently, until maybe 6-8 months ago, the legal description we had from RSA was that you could not fund an audit if you had less than $300,000 and then $500,000, and it's going to $750 next. But if you had less than that, a budget amount that is where you're required to have an audit, that you could not pay for an audit out of federal funds. That is no longer the case. Not that anybody's going to send you a note and tell you so. You can pay for an audit out of your federal funds, even if your grant amount is less than, as long as it's in your budget, your approved budget, and properly allocated. So if your funding is less than that amount, which is currently I think at $500,000 and moving to $750 shortly, if your budget is less than that, they will no longer deny that funding as long as it's in the budget and properly allocated. So it's important to know, audits are really an important thing to keep us all on track. And I know not all of you have a lot of funding to do that, and it's a difficult thing sometimes to do with the smaller centers. What did you think about that minimum amount of funding that the first center got in Berkeley? $1 million grant. Wouldn't you love it? Yeah. There's been a lot of stuff. Then you notice that when the first Part C monies came out, the total amount for the whole 10 centers was $2 million. So immediately we already lost ground, right, in what the basis funding is. There is some really good work being done by April around what is the best minimum amount. Can we establish a minimum amount for a center to be viable? And that's worth looking at, and I know your spill probably has looked at some of that as well. But that's worth having that conversation. It really is tough to meet all the regs and run a small center.
I have a question, Paul. Around the country, the discussion is going on now about whether a place is a 501c3 or not, and what activities they have to be engaged in, and somehow it seems like all of these, what used to be PACs, are now calling themselves not-for-profits, and somehow they're doing all kinds of advocacy, and yet we can't. Are there centers that have different funding or different IRS descriptions?
You know, there are a couple of centers that have two corporations, one under 501c3 and one under 503, I think it is, something, which is for 504. I should remember that number. But anyway, they're organizing under. I haven't seen effect yet to tell if that's made a big difference. But when we go through the lobbying, you'll see that you have two things going, and a lot of the conversation has to do not with this federal use of federal money issue, which is in A122, but with the IRS issue. So you've got two different sets of rules that apply when it comes to the lobbying. One is, can you as a 501c3 do this stuff? And the other is, can you as a federally funded entity do this stuff? And so you've got two different issues going, and we'll try to separate those out for you when we go through the lobbying section, but it is definitely both. And so when you look at those cost principles and what's not allowed, that's only half of the story. You still have the other half of the story, which has to do with how 501c3s can and cannot lobby. And it is very interesting to me, our accounting guru, you all met John, or many of you met John Hebron when he was here a little over a year ago. Maybe it's been 2 years now. Time flies. It's been 2 years now. But he tells us that they're seeing more and more IRS audits of those PACs and other organizations like that. So it is interesting to see that there's a lot more activity around those politically organized organizations than there used to be. Mostly because we're so divided as a country politically that everybody wants to report everybody else. So everybody wants to report the other guy, whoever the other guy is, and so there's more audits happening, kind of coming out of that, evidently coming out of that dichotomy in our country. I think we've covered this. There is a wider application than just Edgar, and the OMB circulars established policies on grant administration One thing that's important to note here, though, is that there are two sides to this. So there's another OMB circular that has to do in education with schools, with government entities, with entities that are not 501c3s. So there's another set of regulations. OMB 86 is the one that we most often look at with cost principles that we would love to use in order to interpret OMB 122, because we think they've got some better stuff over in the education side. And we don't have quite as good a stuff. What's going to happen, though, is that there is a change coming with something that is being called the super circular. And they're combining 86 and 122. Now, the good news about this, there's several pieces of good news about this for you. We'll know more when the regulations are completely developed, because we've only seen like the framework. But one thing is that administrative personnel will be able to do, now right now for 86 it's 6 months. It looks like it's going to be a 3-month or 90-day certification rather than a PAR. Whoa, that's a big change, right?
Yeah.
So that looks like that's coming. Another thing that's coming is clarification around the cost objective. So right now, actually says that the PAR is divided by cost objective. That cost objective has never been defined on the nonprofit side. On the education side, they've defined it and even have examples in their regulations that very clearly say that even if you have two different funding sources, if their purpose is the same, that you don't have to separate them out on your PAR. It's not by funding source, it's by cost objective. And the interpretation that we tried to get from RSA, and legal finally just said, they said, well, it's all going to change in October anyway, so we're not going to give you an interpretation. But the cost was this issue of cost objective, that we wanted them to tell us, and Maya specifically asked us to do this for the state of Kansas, that they wanted us to tell us, well, that would centers that receive both Part B and Part C funding have to do those two funding sources when they're both doing the same 4 core services. Now, cost objective is defined, though, this is going to affect like Link, defined as serving the same geographic area, the same population, with the same core services. So if you serve only youth with part of your grant, you got a grant only for youth, then it still has to be separated because it's a different population. And if you serve some counties with Part C and some counties with Part B, it's a different population. We've had very specific guidance from RSA around your original application. And that is that your Part C money must be used only as your original application indicated. So, for example, with Link, our original application was for 9 counties. You serve quite a few more than that now. So your Part C money can only go to those 9 counties. And if that makes you nervous, we should talk.
Why won't they allow that to, don't things change over time?
Boy, is that a good question. Don't things change over time was Bob's question. And the answer to that is yes, things do change over time. I have asked this question several ways, and the answer I get every time is no, we're bound by that original application. We cannot change it. I have a center I'm working with in another state, and their silk decided we want to have all of the counties served. And so we're going to carve out the extra counties and hand them out to all the centers, and the centers are all going to agree to that, and that's what they did. And so this one center that had a recent review took on one more center. And when RSA came in, they wanted to see the division between the Part C money for the original counties and the Part B money used through the silk for that one county. And it had to be separated out that way. I think we will eventually make progress on this, but I think this is an issue that the centers need to really get on board with, because why do we have a silk and a spill if we aren't keeping track of what the needs are and how they're changing? Now the kind of good news, I mean it's very bad news, but it's good news. Hawaii's center closed, that's the very bad news, because they were not able to come up to regulations. It's been going on for years. But they finally got to the end and had to relinquish their grant. So their Part C money is going back out for bid. And so the first question that the DSU and the Silk and I asked was, well, what's going to be the makeup of the RFP? Is it going to follow the old application, or is it going to follow the spill? And the good news is they said it will absolutely follow the spill. So at least they're recognizing that when something changes and they rebid it, that they have to come up to date with the spill. Now, if we can only get them to also realize that they should do that as time goes on, right? I think it's a regulatory barrier that they haven't figured out a way around. I think that they bumped up against a regulatory barrier, and this was part of their plan of correction with the Office of the Inspector General when RSA was reviewed. This was one of the findings that they had, and so they had to hold people to those applications. But I think there probably is a policy solution if RSA is still in the picture as time goes forward. I bet you there's a policy solution, we just haven't figured it out yet. But anyway, slated to go into effect October 1, we will have a different set of requirements around PARs. And in my conversation with Maya, what she has agreed to is that we will work with you and with her to come up with the sample, simplified, I use that word a lot, simplified PAR that we will post on ILRU's website. So we're going to use John Hebron, and we're going to use this new regulation, and we're going to come up with something so that by October 1, you can look at a simplified PAR, we hope, so you can take a look at that.
So would you be able to do training with us so that we're having a broader view than just the state's interpretation of what's happening?
Maybe. I have 400 centers, and they kind of watch my time to make sure I'm not spending too much of it in one place. So both in California and in Kansas, where I know more people, they're kind of saying, well, you can't just do all of this stuff over and over again. So there are some limitations to my budget. If you guys, if I can work out the time and you guys can work out the budget, absolutely. If that won't work, we can do it by conference call. If that won't work, we can do it by webinar. The issue is, do we want to spend our travel budget to keep going back to the same places because we've got this national scope? But we can certainly do another format, and we can figure out a way to do it. And if you've ever been on one of our webinars, we use Course Avenue as the software. Really excellent, very accessible, easy to do, and we post it when we're done so that people can re-access it as often as they need to. It's posted usually within 24 hours. So that's why I mentioned, when you said you were having an RS review, you've seen the webinar, because we have a 2-part webinar just on that topic of the RSA checklist. So if you find out you're having a review, it's great to go back through that checklist. Who's your reviewer? Who's your state person?
State person, they haven't designated yet, but our federal person is Karina Stiles.
Oh, I don't know Karina yet. She's new. And it may be one of the first reviews she's done. She's been with them a while, and I talked to her on the phone, but I had to have another.
The woman from New Orleans.
Okay.
And the head of it, what's her name? No, not Tim.
Well, Elizabeth,
Tyke.
Deborah,
Tim's
Deb Cotter.
been invited, but he hasn't.
Okay, sometimes he goes and sometimes he doesn't. That's great. Since you've got deaf services, that would be really nice, actually. It could be really good.
But peer reviewer Frida Clearwater.
So, do you know where Frida's from?
Frida Clearwater from Oklahoma, so I know her, she's familiar with rural stuff.
A lot of times the RSA reviewers will allow you to suggest a peer reviewer if you have somebody you know that's on their list. They aren't adverse to that because of the peer review concept. And in most states, the SILC is invited to observe, and the DSU is invited to send somebody. So that's part of their mechanism for putting it all together. So what fun, what fun. All right, that's the end of the Rehab Act overview. We're a few minutes early. Is lunch close enough that we should go do it, or?
I don't know, let me go look.
Why don't you look while I just talk about these two. So here you'll find these links are for the actual Rehab Act, the most recent one, and a short history of the sit-in for the IL regs and funds. It's a little different history than the one we showed. Just it has some different facts that it emphasizes that Dretta put out, so you might want to take a look at those. Any questions or comments about the general stuff with the Rehab Act? We're going to continue some more after lunch, but this is a good stopping point maybe. Questions? Comments? We'll come back